Welcome to the 17th episode of Foreign Correspondents Deeper into Hitchcock podcast. My name is Michał Leszczyk, and I'm joined as always by my co-host
Sebastian Smoliński. Hello.
Today we will discuss one of my favorite Hitchcock films, the 1935 thriller The 39 Steps, a film based on a novel by John Buchan, a film that is widely appreciated as probably the earliest possible and the earliest perfect incarnation of the so-called Hitchcock thriller. But before we delve into discussion, I just want to introduce a very special guest that we have tonight. With us is David Cairns, who is a Scottish writer and filmmaker. He writes a blog at Shadowplay, and he teaches film at Edinburgh College of Art. He also has a novel that he just published, which he will tell us about later in the episode. Hello, David.
Hello, Michael, and hello, Sebastian.
It's wonderful to have you here, and we will be discussing the 39 Steps, the Hitchcock thriller made in 1935, which I revisited after many years, actually. I watched it many years ago, and all I remembered from it was this basically pure delight. I remember being sort of carried away with it. It's a very brisk, very pleasurable experience, nonsensical at times, but nevertheless extremely enjoyable. So I will just start this episode by asking you two the same question. What was your first experience of this film like? And we will start with David and then move to Sebastian, and how this experience actually changed over the years as you revisited it.
Oh, I don't remember strongly when I first saw it, unfortunately. I have an uncomfortable feeling I might have been slightly underwhelmed. I'm not sure. I may have tuned in partly just because I'd heard that some of it took place in Scotland and interested in Hitchcock at an early age, but not knowing very much about him, and tuning in on television to see it, maybe just to see the Forth Rail Bridge in a film, and then maybe being disappointed that there wasn't more of that. So from a Monuments point of view, I felt slightly shortchanged. I certainly, when I revisited it, particularly when I did a thing similar to what you're doing. I spent a year watching every Alfred Hitchcock film, and this was a real highlight. Realize how very good it is. The briskness, that sense of energy that they've discovered certain things that are really fun to do and really work with the previous film, and now it's jumping into that with even more confidence, I think, and it's the discovery of the wrong man on the run narrative, which is so useful to Hitchcock, and that he maybe revisited more than he should have, but we can't really fault him for it because we end up with North by Northwest. I think it's one of the most interesting and pleasurable things about it was that sense of confidence, that the mixture of thrills and humor, a sort of real world environment, but something where you sort of escape from reality, even while you're watching somebody who's having a terrible time with his own reality. And everything just seems to work, even things that are a little bit unusual, like the leading lady showing up very late in the story. Just everything seems well judged and successful, and that turns out to be a really good call. I suppose it's I had, at the time I saw it for the first time, I had seen Bond films, and they frequently had the notion of there's two women, one he meets early on who's useful but gets killed, and one who becomes the leading lady for later in the story. And that Bond connection, where North by Northwest is sort of like a what if James Bond was an advertising executive who wasn't used to this kind of thing. I've lost track of my own sentence there, but this is the sort of excitement that the film produces in me. I think it's seeing Hitchcock and Charles Bennett really on top of their game and realizing that it's not a formula yet, but there's a bunch of ingredients that are useful and that they know they can do well.
It's a great description of this film, and Yeah, I would say that from today's perspective, this fact that it's so fresh, that after watching, many other movies, we come back to this one and it's still fresh. But I wanted to start with, a small anecdote about my teenage years, because I saw it first when I was around 15 or 16. I was watching Hitchcock movies then, just, discovering the art of cinema, and 39 Steps was one of the first. And I would say that in my memory, Mr. Memory was the character that really, now I'm recollecting, and when I was watching the film, I discovered how a great idea it is. Supposedly, at least that's what I found, it's based on a real person that was called Datas. Like a person who also, could perform tricks like that in London, had huge knowledge. But I think this character also, what I'll try to express by it is that it's a great film for both for teenagers and for, let's say, adult viewers. It works on both of these levels, and of course it's not the only Hitchcock film that works that way, but I would say that this one really has this appeal for, it's a, boyish film in a way, but also in a way you can kind of try to feel deeper as a, this vision of men's responsibilities, or vision of marriage or marriages. So I would say that it just tastes differently when I watch it when I'm still pretty young, but almost 30. It's still as funny as when I was watching it when I was 15.
Well, I'm almost 40, so we are at different stages of this journey, but I would say that, part of the pleasure of the film and part of the appeal that you mentioned is that we actually witness a transition, because, Hani begins the movie as a pretty careless and carefree character, and ends as a character who is ready to accept some responsibility. And I always, now that I revisited it, I have to say that one of the scenes that I found absolutely outstanding in its very simplicity is the dinner scene between Henny and Annabella Smith, when he's preparing the fish for her, in this very simple kitchen, just a very simple scene, a very simple setup, and they're just having this chat that just happens to be about the future of the world, maybe, but it's such an understated moment, which I really enjoyed. But yeah, I would say that there are those both forces, being carefree and just, having no attachments at all, and actually saving your country. There are those two.
Yeah. The idea of Hanny as this character who's sort of just come into London is British, or I think South African, maybe in the book, or maybe is he Canadian here?
Yeah. In the movie, he's Canadian. Yeah.
Is a interesting one. It's almost the only thing they've kept. And I think the first line of the novel contains the thought that he might go to the music hall, and he doesn't. But the idea of this man without attachments seems to be the key thing, and in the course of the story, he develops an attachment. So that's sort of useful. And maybe they felt that having the protagonists in the previous film, in The Man Who Knew Too Much, being a couple with a child and a friend, they already have a cluster of attachments, and it might be interesting to strip all that away and go with something that starts with quite a bare bones figure in an unfurnished flat almost, and then build him up from there. You start with, he's almost a blank slate, except that he's played by a movie star, so the audience has a relationship with him already.
Well, I would like to ask you both, actually. There was one thing about the film that sort of stood out for me this time around. When I was a child, I began my adventure with cinema really with the Indiana Jones movies. This seems in a way related. I mean, it's almost like an Indiana Jones movie before there was Indiana Jones. There's one adventure after the other, and it's just being accumulated. But I wanted to ask you about the serious notes in the film, because there are several scenes that are I would say, absolutely serious, and I mean especially the Crofter's wife moment, which has this gravity that pulls the film into something extremely almost painful. Do you detect moments like that in this carefree film, that moments of real gravity?
Yeah, and it's quite an odd thing to do when you think about it. It's not something that you would ever expect to see, for instance, in an Indiana Jones film, where we have a motor driving this story. We have a strong sense of it being like one thing after another, a series of problems and escapes and difficult tasks to perform and complications, and it feels quite movie serial like in that way that makes us think of James Bond or Indiana Jones. But then it slows the pace down for a sort of character study of this unhappy relationship, in which the hero's intervention isn't going to help. It's not like he transforms this couple's lives or rescues the girl or anything. She gets nothing out of it except suffering, and is then left out behind in the story. It's not resolved. So I think it works. I can't explain why it works other than it's done well. But it is a surprising beat to have in that kind of a film. And can we think of other Hitchcock films that do this? I can't think of obvious examples, but certainly there are Hitchcock films that use a slightly episodic structure with a strong through line that will lead us into encounters with different characters along the way. I can't think of one that does a sort of tonal shift like this. That isn't there for a clear payoff. It's just a little portrait of a situation. Hitchcock claims that it's sort of inspired by a joke, I think.
Yes.
A sort of a dirty joke. But it certainly doesn't play out as humorous in the film at all. But it's I guess, a modulation in tone, maybe a way of reminding us that there is a serious side to this film, and so that maybe it helps make the threat of death more compelling when we're spending a certain amount of the time being quite carefree, or at least we're moving swiftly on through a series of adventures and scrapes in which danger is there, but it's sort of quite exciting danger. And this somber note maybe is just to warn us. It's an odd one.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I would say The Trouble with Harry has, this tremendous tonal shifts, but it's totally different kind of shifts, I would say. It's a really odd movie, and yeah, I would say you're right that it's the kind of the only one. If you remember the shot with Nova Pilbeam from The Man Who Knew Too Much, when she's abducted, and it's like this very expressionistic, almost fairy tale like shot, it also like this few seconds of something a bit different. It's also quite striking. I would also say that these shifts maybe owe a bit to the general mix of genres in this film. I was surprised to discover after the years how close to Screwball it is, and how well documented that is. It's not that contemporary historians say, parts of it look like it happened one night, but also there was this very conscious effort on the part of filmmakers to somehow capitalize on this new adventurous genre, the screwball kind. So we could say that Hitchcock maybe consciously wanted to do these Capra-like beats in one or other place. So that's really interesting, because we have so many different, as you mentioned, so many different ingredients with spy story, this everyman story, comedy, but also this great attention to detail. Like this, many people say that Crofter's sequence, let's say, at this Crofter's cottage is a small movie in itself, right? Like kind of one of the sequences that is in a way self-contained, I would say. I'm
very curious, and I hope that I will be able to pose the question in the right way, but we bring our, let's say, Eastern European perspective to watching Hitchcock. That's why the podcast is called Foreign Correspondence, because we are from the outside of that world. But I'm really interested, and I don't want to burden you with making you the spokesman for Scottish culture in general. But I would be really interested in what it means for you as a Scotsman to watch this film, and is there anything truly Scottish about it? How could we detect that element?
Well, John Buchan was a Scot, so that we have a Scottish origin for the story, but they use very little of the story. But I guess they wouldn't have had the idea of telling the story if the novel hadn't been there, and it has that sort of prototype for things like Rogue Male, which became Lang's Manhunt. The idea of a man who's being hunted, who it's not just a chase; he's got to achieve something while being chased, and he can't turn to anybody for help. And that sort of does come out of the novel. Although Hitchcock said, when he started looking at it with a serious mind to adapting, he found there was almost not a scene in it really that you could take that would work as a film. Partly because the guy's got nobody to talk to, nobody to care about, nobody. It's just him on his own thinking about what to do next, which is not so filmic. But Scottishness, other than the source, Buchan's also interesting because he was vaguely involved in espionage himself. Like a lot of our spy writers, he had some sort of a Secret Service kind of military intelligence background. And then, of course, it's a film with a good MacGuffin, and a MacGuffin is a device for catching lions or possibly elephants in the Scottish Highlands, and we go to the Scottish Highlands in this film, so there's that. But it's there was no real Scottish cinema at that time. Virtually nothing was being made by Scots in Scotland, certainly not with Scottish money, except in a documentary or amateur way. So we tend to be grateful for the cultural appropriation when anybody actually deigns to come and visit us and make something there and thinks we're important enough to make a film about. So we're quite proud of films like this, and Billy Wilder's Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, which I have a lot of affection for. Michael Powell's two Scottish films, Alexander McKendrick's two Scottish films, with the added benefit that he was sort of Scottish and sort of American at the same time. But he always considered himself an outsider, whichever country he was filming in.
And James Bond was a Scot by virtue of being played by the late Sean Connery.
Yes. I think even there's some Scottish background to the character. But so there's all these things. These things connect up quite nicely, and it's and it's not embarrassing. Although there aren't really a lot of convincing Scottish accents in it. The only one really is John Laurie as the crofter. He's I think the only real Scot that we hear from. But I think he was a crofter's son in real life, so he's very authentic, so far as we know. And he had been a successful Hamlet on stage. And apparently, if you met him, this was the first thing he would want to talk about. First words out of his mouth. And then several Powell and Pressburger films, and long career. And as a very old man, he starred in a hugely successful British sitcom called Dad's Army, which was about the Home Guard, where he played the pessimistic Scot, which was one of our great stereotypes is being gloomy, and he embodies that particularly well. And yeah, my wife's reminding me of his catchphrase in Dad's Army was "We're all doomed."
Oh, yeah.
He did. So we always like him. I think it's always good to see him doing his fiercely committed performances. He can get a little bit carried away sometimes, but he's great when he's kept in check slightly. And I think Hitchcock kept an eye on him in this one. He's also in. Am I right in thinking Juno and the Paycock?
in one of the earlier ones, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
I think it's in the Peacock, where he's one of the few non-Irish people, but he's a Celt, so it's considered close enough. And he does get a bit carried away in that one.
So maybe to kind of develop this question, because what you say is very interesting, but also, there's this famous book, English Hitchcock by Charles Barr, that we're referring to constantly, making this podcast. And, he claims at the beginning that really we should, as he titled his book, we should, call Hitchcock cinema English cinema of the spirit, not British, really. Would you agree with that? Would you say that? Because when we think about 39 Steps, it starts to be a bit, maybe not really accurate. I mean, this movie, even if the view of Scotland is a bit of a, postcard view, I would say, it's. I know it's complicated, but that's also from my perspective as a Pole, this question of Englishness, being Scottish, being British. What's the relation between these two in this case, would you say?
In this case, you could be skeptical about it and say that, The Man Who Knew Too Much is not a partly Swiss film. We get some rear projection shots of the Forth Bridge and Waverley Station. So they're very briefly in my home city. And then there's some hillsides that are, I think, not Scotland. And the Crofter's House, which is a beautiful, almost German expressionist exterior set that looks exactly like its storyboard drawings. So it's I think it's sort of as it's as Scottish really as the second Man Who Knew Too Much is Moroccan, or the first Man Who Knew Too Much is Swiss. I think we can't lay a claim to it. In terms of Hitchcock's Britishness versus Englishness, I think everybody from the British Isles has a sort of dual identity. So I think I don't have any trouble with Hitchcock being English and British, because I think I'm Scottish and British for the time being, until we manage to escape from it's like tethered to a screaming maniac at the moment, while immersed in water. So yeah, Hitchcock is English and he's also British, and certain aspects that and he's also a Londoner, and from a social class, and all of these parts of his identity, and male, and Catholic. I think these are all factors, and it's pretty hard to separate them out. But Englishness has certain qualities that you can see in Hitchcock, and for sure, he's very proper, and he liked his screenwriters to wear a suit and tie when they came to a meeting. He was unhappy if they were open at the neck, and that seems un-American and quite English and quite off its time as well. It's his period. The period that he comes from is crucial too, isn't it? But yeah, I'm not being English. It's hard for me to separate out which aspects of him are, could be said to be generally British and which are specifically English, and so forth. And probably, had he been Scottish, many things might have been different. The portrayal of Scotland in this might have been different. I don't know. But I don't think as I say, there's nothing in it that we find usually embarrassing. So, we don't demand that all Scots be portrayed as positive. He meets a number of Scottish people of varying degrees of honesty and virtue and meanness, and certainly the very Calvinistic gloominess and joylessness of the Crofter is quite interesting and cheeky as a comment from a Catholic filmmaker, and I think not entirely inaccurate. There is that in the Scottish character, isn't there? And we know of it in that particular place, that particular religion, which does believe that we're all doomed, unless you're one of the very lucky ones, which you don't necessarily know. You can be as virtuous as you like, and you're still not getting into heaven if you're not on the list. So it's a religion that goes well with that sort of a mood. The Scottish actor Brian Cox, who played Hannibal Lecter, the first on-screen Lecter, has a theory that it's the potatoes we eat. That potatoes are a depressant, he says. And you eat a potato and you immediately feel a little bit knocked off, he says. And the Scots eat a lot of potatoes.
Well, that would definitely make us your kin, because in Poland we also eat lots of potatoes. It's called potato country sometimes. But just a brief question about the ending of the film. The famous shot, the long shot, of the dancers in the background, of Mr. Memory dying in the middle ground, and of the hands being joined in the foreground. And of course, the hands are being joined, but there's a handcuff hanging from one of the arms. I wanted to just ask you, how do you read this scene? Is the handcuff akin to the cast that Jimmy Stewart has in the final shot of Rear Window, where we see the freshly formed marriage, but the guy's legs are actually both broken? Or like is it a premonition of the things to come in this marriage, or is it just more of a remnant of the old of the days that they already went through? How do you read the handcuffs?
I'm amused by them. I don't see it as, I don't think it's a terribly pessimistic comment on marriage or the hopes of happiness, but it's there as a joke that can be read that way. So I think we're meant to laugh at that possible meaning without necessarily saying, happiness is over for these characters and they're now going to be tied together and all free will gone. It's part of a very nice set of hand-related images that runs all the way through the film, from the bad guy with the missing finger, of course. It's so much of this film is about hands. I once made a little video essay where I just took all the hand close-ups and strung them together, not terribly skillfully, but I was quite pleased with the effect, because you basically got the story of the film in hands. It's just huge numbers of hand shots in this movie, and lots of very sort of specific ones. And it begins with the hand with the ticket checking into the music hall. So they're there at the beginning, they're there at the end. It's really, it's really a neat image plan for this movie. So I like it for that reason. It's structurally so good as to end that way, and it's saying yes, they're free from their handcuffs, but they're voluntarily staying that way. So in that sense, I think you could see it as quite a positive. Having been forced together, now they're together because they like it. So that's not necessarily too cynical, is it? Maybe it's the romantic in me.
So I guess you're happy that they didn't use the filmed sequence that was to come after this last shot, right?
Oh, remind me.
There was this last scene, supposedly shot, at least I think there are some stills from it still existing, in which Robert Donat character says that, they are actually married, because since they gave their names in this place where they were spending the night, so they are technically married. In Scottish law, they are married. That's something like that. So it's made very explicit. I think some people say it was planned that way for the sake of the censors.
I don't think they need it, certainly. And I don't think that is how Scottish marriage law works.
Maybe in the 1930s, maybe.
Was there some plan at one point that there was going to be like a hidden airfield in Scotland, and they would have to catch the spies in some kind of large-scale action sequence? I think that was thought about. And instead they do, again, what's quite a nice thing structurally, which is head back down to London and Mr. Memory and end there. And it would be a set piece that you don't need, because in line with it being a MacGuffin, we don't care really what the 39 steps are, as long as there's some sort of answer. Really, it's a new romance whose purpose is to bring the hero and heroine together.
But I think it's quite funny that if you saw the remakes, I just saw parts of them. The 59 version and I think 78 version, at least 59 version begins with the shot of the stairs. So it's made very, it's from the very first shot we know that there are stairs, and I think in the 78 version, even the character in the very first scene counts the steps. The character is coming down and he's 37, 38, 39. So, and when you think about the original Hitchcock version, then, you don't care for the almost 90 minutes what these 39 steps are, and then suddenly it turns out that, it's the name of the spy net, which is also kind of improbable. So, I think it's kind of lovely that the Hitchcock did that way, and it's a bit strange that, future directors wanted to be so explicit, in such a material that really doesn't cry for that, I would say.
It's a funny one because it feels a little bit like they, at a certain point, quite early on, they decided, well, we're not really going to do the book because it doesn't really offer that much that we can use. We'll just take the character, we'll adapt the book, but we'll adapt it out of all recognition, and we'll just do what seems to be interesting and amusing, using the very loosest element. And then they would get to the end and they go, oh, hang on a minute, if we are calling it the 39 steps, we got to mention that somewhere. So it does feel like a slightly last minute inspiration. But that, again, it's such a, it would be pathetic to really be annoyed by that. So it's quite pleasing that it's so throwaway and daft. What else could it be? Well, it's the name of the organization of spies. So if we know that, then we're happy.
Yeah, I find it almost touching that they actually kept the title. That it doesn't connect to anything in the film apart from Mr. Memory mentioning it.
I guess the book had some kind of fame. It's been filmed multiple times since, and it must have been successful because Buchan wrote sequels with the same character, which very rarely get filmed. There was a TV series.
Right?
But nobody else has found any of those books worth filming, I think. I think it had some kind of name recognition, and people must have read it, but they must have felt that nobody would mind if the film was completely different, but B, calling it the 39 steps would give it a certain casting.
Do they still read it? I mean, is it still obvious that if you like this movie, you read the book, or it doesn't really work that way?
I think it's still in print, easy to get anyway. And Buchan wrote historical novels, which are mostly, I think, really turgid and hard to get through, and that one is probably the readable one, apart from the anti-Semitism, which I was pleased to see Hitchcock remove ruthlessly, because I think it's a completely it's a Semitic conspiracy in the book, and it's fairly clearly labeled as such, and it's pretty creepy.
Yes, you're right. I mean, I've read the novel just to prepare for our conversation, and I was of course surprised by this one. By the way, it's also interesting that you have this. I mean, in British literature, you had this anti-Semitic themes because, of course, in Polish literature, it's also a problem. I mean, we also have a history of this difficult relationship with our Jewish minority. But also, I was really surprised, and of course, it's the biggest change that they did, that the book doesn't really have even a single important woman character. It's a bit strange, right? I mean, I was really expecting something more kind of showing the relation between the two genders, at least as in the movie, but no, it's a lonely man, just in the Scottish moors, which is exciting, but a bit, different. I think it's really now, it really feels old-fashioned that you have this boys club, you have this important politicians, you have all these men, and not a single woman's character. So
it would have been an obvious one to change, wouldn't it? If you were making a film then, you'd be looking at it and going, say, where's the girl? So there's no girl, so how can we get a girl into it, and where will she come in, and what will happen? And it was just inevitably there would be a romance in a movie of that time, unless the story was so well known and so it was considered just essential that you couldn't do that. They put romantic interest into Moby Dick, so they would for sure, if you're doing John Buchan, you're going to have a romance. What's impressive is that it's so good, that It's proper. Don't get on it first for good narrative reasons, kind of thing. It's not that he's a lout who has to learn to be sensitive. It's just that he's in a deadly situation where he has to behave in an insensitive way to stay alive, and she doesn't understand that and has to learn to understand it. And then it's okay. She realizes that he's honest and he's a man in danger, and also he's a brave and noble man. But that conflict is really good, and we've seen romantic comedies that had that sparring initially, often in the form of a road movie. And I hadn't thought of it in terms of It Happened One Night, but that's a very good model for this. And there are other Hollywood screwball comedies that have a slight thriller plotline. I'm thinking of a not too great one called It's a Wonderful World with James Stewart, but not to be confused with It's a Wonderful Life. That is a sort of couple on the run, bickering, in danger road movie thriller, but everything in it's played for comedy.
When I think about 39 Steps, it's also, I would say, part of a possible parallel history of cinema. And let me explain what I mean. The movie was designed by Michael Balcon as this vehicle that was to conquer Hollywood, right? Or if not to conquer, then at least to compete on equal terms with Hollywood films in US. So it was pretty successful in US, as Mark Glancy notes, who wrote the book about 39 Steps. But it wasn't a smash hit. So it's kind of more of a what if question. What would happen if 39 Steps would be a smashing success? Would British cinema become more successful earlier on? Would Hitchcock stay in UK because he would find great resources there? Would you say that is there any possibility that film history could look differently if Michael Balcon would succeed and British movies were so successful in Hollywood?
I feel like there are probably some scenarios in which the course of British film history could be changed, but probably not through any film being very successful. Because what happens when a British film is very successful is that everybody involved goes to Hollywood. And the more successful the film is, in a way, the more likely that is to happen, because they'll get offered more money. And they'll be, offered the big toys and so on. Yes, you can imagine filmmakers staying in Britain because they're given great creative freedom here. And that, I suppose, is sort of what happened with Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger during their Rank phase of their career. They were happy at Rank and they didn't feel the need to go anywhere else. But yeah, I think probably the only ways in which you could turn the course of British film history into a fresh direction would be to have something along the way fail even more spectacularly than it did. I think everything that we do that's successful simply leads to an exodus. And the only chance that we've got of recovering from that is for the filmmakers to have such a bad time in Hollywood that they come back, which occasionally happens.
Yeah.
We got Bill Forsyth back because he had a really bad experience.
And you got few Americans like Kubrick, right?
Yeah, occasionally, and he's a really exceptional case. But yeah, glad to have him. And all the other filmmakers we got from America around then were by and large blacklistees. And then Richard Lester, who a little bit like Kubrick, just didn't want to live in America, but didn't think that there was a great career for him in a country where English was not the first language. Then, well, after America, what's your next choice to be a filmmaker? And at that time, Britain was slightly ahead of Canada, so Britain was the one to go for. And then Kubrick felt he needed to be near good film studios. But he didn't want to live in Hollywood, and he didn't want to live in New York for whatever reason. And Hitchcock could if Hitchcock had flopped in America, I imagine he would have come back, and I imagine we'd have been glad to have him. Whether we would have rolled out the carpet and given him the opportunities, or would he be back to square one, trying to, would he be back making waltzes from Vienna, or champagne or something that he wasn't so enthusiastic about? Not that those are necessarily dreadful films, as you've said. But yeah, suppose Rebecca went really badly and Selznick cancelled his contract or something and nobody else wanted him, then Hitchcock that's an interesting what if, because Hitchcock comes back during wartime.
Yeah.
There was a little bit of ill feeling about him leaving when he did, of course, but he made some films for the war effort. But yeah, it would be kind of interesting if he'd come back ahead of Frenzy.
And maybe he would direct some cult classic Ealing comedy then, right? Who knows?
Yes, because of course, good relationship with Balkan. And Ealing was quite a good environment for individualistic directors. It was a very group-oriented studio, but at the same time, filmmakers with quite odd visions were able to make slightly peculiar films, even films that Balkan didn't get or like very much. He would actually sign off on if the filmmakers were passionate enough. So he didn't care for Kind Hearts and Coronets. It disturbed him, and he wasn't at all keen on the Lady Killers, but he made him. So one can imagine, certainly one could imagine The Trouble with Harry being made in Britain, and maybe being welcomed more as well, because it's quite an English sense of humor, as Spike Milligan said, the British, as soon as you mention death, somebody laughs.
Well, then Scotland could be replaced in that film. Vermont could be replaced with Scotland in that scenario.
I think you need more sun. You need reasonably good weather. And so you could imagine it happening in sort of P.G. Wodehouse territory, down in Surrey or something, where it's quite balmy. And it's these are a little bit like P.G. Wodehouse characters, because they're but there's a death in their midst which wouldn't happen in Wodehouse.
Well, there is an air of Bertie about Robert Donat, I guess, as well. I mean, he has a valet in the book, but in the movie, valet is missing. So,
yeah.
I have one more question. The question is a little bit provocative in terms of genre, because. And it's a question to you both. How much do you think the Hitchcock thriller is still alive? Or are there actually any recent examples that we could think of? Or is it only our cinephile delusion that we like to tell ourselves that, this is the genre that actually proved so immortal? Because when I was thinking about, this particular kind of film, I was hard pressed to find an example of a film that would be that, as I said, carefree and pleasurable at the same time, and not burdened with any social meaning, let's say. So, do you think that the Hitchcock thriller in the 2000s, let's say, is still a genre that's alive, or is it pretty much a historic phenomenon?
It's between the two, maybe. I feel like whenever somebody does try to do something that's a bit in the realm of what Ernest Lehman called the sort of classic Hitchcock film, when North by Northwest was made as a very conscious attempt to put in all the ingredients. And of course, lots of Hitchcock films don't have all of the ingredients. But that kind of romance and comedy and thrills mixed together thing does occasionally happen. But when it does, it feels a little bit retro, and it feels like the filmmakers are after something that is slightly from a bygone age. Some of these films may be successful, others not, but it's a little bit like Westerns. You can still do them, but it will feel like a reference to something before. I see so few new films, but I remember quite enjoying a few years ago Night and Day with Tom Cruise and Cameron Diaz, which some people hated, and I thought was quite good fun. And it's interesting because it posits the Tom Cruise action hero, who is still sort of superhuman. He is the Mission Impossible guy in a lot of ways, but we're not quite sure about him in this narrative, and he's not the point of view character. It's Cameron Diaz's movie, in which this action hero is her romantic interest, which is a slightly different slant on it that brings it a little bit more into line with not so much Hitchcock's chase thrillers, but more into line with other Hitchcock films like with The Birds or Marnie, where she's not the romantic interest, she's actually the point of view character. And because of that, Tom Cruise's character seems like he's a maniac, because that's how an action hero would be to our eyes if we saw them in real life. So I kind of enjoyed that slant on it. So yeah, people are still doing it, and they're still doing it at a fairly high budgetary level, but more occasionally than they used to, and it's always with a sort of backward glance, I think. Mm-hmm. It's not the top genre, is it?
So you say it's always self-conscious in a way.
Yeah, of course Hitchcock is somewhat self-conscious, but the genre was something that you could look at as just a very natural thing to do in the 1930s. Maybe less so in Britain. Maybe it had to be discovered as a thing that could be plausibly made in Britain, and which is why he had so much trouble finding projects that he wanted to make earlier in the 30s.
But I'm thinking about this other very successful British filmmaker, Christopher Nolan, he's no Hitchcock, of course, but if you think about Tenet and the fact that the main protagonist was named protagonist, it's kind of like 39 Steps in a way that he's carte blanche. He's a character that we project onto, so he doesn't have anything specific about him. So I would say it's one of the elements that connect these two universes, I would say, but also look how criticized Nolan was for doing that by many critics, many members of the audience, that it's not plausible and not filled in enough. I mean, the character is not really built, he's not interested in psychology, and I would say it's part of the criticism that Hitchcock met so often, at least when it comes to his adventurous movies, because then he became a master of psychology, I would say, but certainly it's not the case of 39 Steps, right? You must be open for this kind of adventure. I don't know if this comparison kind of convinces any one of you, but
Tenet is definitely a film made under the influence of the Bond series, and the Bond series, I think, needed the model of North by Northwest in particular to approach things the way it did, and Cary Grant was approached to play James Bond, and very possibly would have been good, but. So yeah, so even if it's indirect, I mean, I think Hitchcock's grammar influences everybody. I think and anybody who works in thrillers, even if they're radically different kind of thrillers, I'm sure David Fincher, and I'm sure we obviously we know of Brian De Palma, but more current filmmakers than De Palma are still looking at Hitchcock and stealing ideas or learning from his example. But that. The feeling of the Hitchcock thriller is, it's more likely to be present now in films in a more indirect film, in an indirect way. The things that Hitchcock influenced are now influencing new films, or maybe the things that he influenced other things that have influenced other things that are influencing new films. I mean, I don't think cinema can purge him from its DNA. Now he's just in there.
Before we say goodbye tonight, please tell us a little bit more about the novel you wrote. We would love to hear more about it.
Yeah, I've just written a novel, which is a bit of a departure for me. I'm a filmmaker as well as a critic. I've kind of done the career arc backwards. You can definitely say that you're on some kind of successful path when you start as a critic and become a filmmaker. I've done it the wrong way around, but. To compensate for the films that I've not been able to make, I've written a novel, and I've just sort of put everything in it that I like. So it's a black comedy, horror, science fiction, World War II, whodunit. So if you like genres, it's got several, and I just having fun with words instead of images. And it's available on Amazon, and it's called We Used Dark Forces, which is a nod to Dennis Wheatley, the fascist writer of bad satanic horror stories. and it's full of Britishness, as opposed to Englishness, I suppose. But set in Scotland. But I'm trying to see Scotland with an outsider's eye. People who like my writing could check this out because there's a lot of my writing in it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Please say hello to your wife and have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
You too. Thanks.
Thank you. Goodbye.
That was a wonderful opportunity to talk to David. I really enjoyed the tropes and the interpretations that he offered. Sebastian, is there anything that you would like to add that we missed during the discussion?
I don't think so. I think I'm also delighted with this conversation, and I must say that I'm full of awe when I watch David's video essays. He's, I think, one of the best video essay filmmakers working today. So it's such a pleasure that he found time for us to join us for this conversation. And I would say that we are just starting with this spy thrillers, and if we'll be able to maybe come up with some new interesting facts or information about 39 Steps, we can always add them to our next episode, which will be devoted to a film, Secret Agent.
And the 18th episode, next time we'll discuss Secret Agent, based on the Ashenden stories by William Somerset Maugham. And absolutely, please share the news about our podcast. Please like our fan page, Foreign Correspondents Deeper into Hitchcock. We would love to bring even more Hitchcock experts in our following episodes, and we would love to invite more Hitchcock scholars to discuss Alfred Hitchcock's films with us. So if you like this podcast, please spread the word. And that's it in the 17th episode of Foreign Correspondents
Deeper into Hitchcock.